Hello. In 1982, a young congressman, during a session, was allotted exactly 1 minute to talk about a bill that he felt very passionate about. This young congressman made a statement that has become legendary in the Congress. I suspect it's one of the few times that someone really expressed how he felt. He told his colleague, "Take your time and shove it." Now, you will never believe, my fellow Louisianians, who said that. None other than one Henson Moore. What did this young congressman go on to accomplish? Let me start at the very marvelous indices of what he's done with his life. He is the only Louisianian in history, the only one, to serve as an assistant to the President of the United States. It didn't begin all that auspiciously. Henson, you were born in Lake Charles.
Born in Lake Charles only because the ferry was running that day and my mama could get to the hospital in Lake Charles.
But you were raised
in Hackberry, a little village down about 30, 40 miles south of Lake Charles, down in Cameron Parish.
Population what, Henson?
Back then, maybe it really hit a busting 500. Today, it must be around 200.
Now, the Henson Moore whom we all know and love was not a particularly good kid, was he?
Back then, there wasn't any kind of organized athletics, Gus, and so we kids, being kids, we'd get together and do things. I was kind of the oldest kid in the neighborhood, 7, 8, 9 years old, so we'd untie all the crew boats and let them float down the bayou. Or the neighbor had some cows, we'd let them out and drive them into the marsh. Or we'd pull the volunteer fire department fire alarm, and it was something that, there's a funny story that it got people so mad at me, they used to tell my mama, Henson, or they'd tell my mama, they'd say, that son of yours, Henson's going straight to Angola as soon as he's 18. He's going straight to Angola. So in 1974, we won the first race for Congress. My mother remembered that and called back to one of those ladies that lived right by the ferry. My mama says, "Girlie, remember what you used to say about my son Henson going to prison?" And Girlie said, "Yeah." She said, "I don't know if you're watching TV tonight, but he won that election to Congress. What do you think about that? What do you think about him now?" Girlie said, "Well, he's a politician, isn't he? He's right on schedule."
A typical Louisiana answer. Henson, you grew up in the oil industry, yes, but not in a boardroom.
No.
Tell us a little bit about your background.
My daddy started off in the oil fields, working at the lowest job there is, the roustabout. And by the time we were in Hackberry, by the time I was born, he had worked his way up to where he was a roughneck, and then he worked his way into the office as a clerk. And we lived in a very small little oil camp. And for people, Gus, you remember those days, all across South Louisiana, because there weren't towns with houses available. When an oil field was found, they'd go in, they'd build a camp. And that's where the oil workers would live and their families. And they were all over South Louisiana. My wife grew up in the same kind of family from Franklin, Louisiana. Well, her daddy worked in the oil fields too. And so my dad worked in the oil fields much as a coal miner would do in Pennsylvania or something like that. Worked his way up and finally got into the office work and that sort of thing, and ultimately worked his way up to where he was sent to Houston as the president of the biggest drilling company in the world.
Goodness.
But that was a Horatio Alger story. He didn't own it. He started out working as just as the lowest job you can do. And so in those early years, I grew up living in South Louisiana around oil rigs and oil camps and learning how to swim in the canal and catching crabs for supper and doing the kind of things that you do. And it was only in a place like Louisiana could you do that. And it was just an absolutely wonderful memory. I took my kids back, Gus, years later, drove them through Hackberry. And they'd look at me and they'd look at Hackberry and they'd say, "Daddy, you came from here?" They couldn't believe that.
Henson, did that experience of seeing what your father achieved, starting at the very bottom and working himself up to a substantial position, in other words, working for what he got, did that influence you philosophically and later on in your political career and so on?
I think you ask that question to anybody about their parents, they'd say, sure. In my case, my father was a very strong-willed individual. He was a prize fighter as a youth, really tough. He believes in things very passionately. People that know him to this day know that when he says something, he believes it. It taught me several things. One, you got to work, that nobody's going to give you anything. Nobody gave my dad a thing. He grew up in the Depression and went to work in the oil fields, and so, like a lot of people watching this telecast, he grew up with it tough. Secondly, he believed in honesty. Treat everything as honestly as you know how to do. And thirdly, he taught me to believe in something and to try to accomplish something. And he'd watch the news at night and just get really upset about what he saw going on in politics. And he taught me that we all have an obligation to try to do something to make that better. And so he made a very strong impression on my life, yeah.
Henson, when did y'all move to Baton Rouge?
We moved when I was in the 5th grade from Lake Charles. We lived in Lake Charles about 4 years after Hackberry, and we moved here when I was in about the 5th grade.
And you attended Louisiana State University?
3 times.
3 times. Once undergraduate.
And then graduate school, well, then the law school, then graduate school.
And of all things, you were in the military, and Henson Moore was a military policeman.
Yep.
In Germany, I think.
In Germany for 2 years.
How'd you like that experience?
I loved it. I never forget, I was taking my last bar exam. I came home, my last exam in law school, rather, and I came home, and I'd always been told, if you ever got a chance to talk to the man that does the assigning of you in the military, that you had it made. They send you these forms, where would you like to serve in the military?
Yes.
And you put down 3 places, and then they throw it away, and they send you to just the opposite of what you request.
Of course.
The way it normally works. And so if you want to go someplace warm, they send you someplace cold. Well, this guy got me on the phone, and he said, look, Lieutenant, you're getting ready to come in the Army. We don't have time to get you a new form and whatever. Where'd you like to go? I said, well, I'd like to go to Europe. I thought he'd laugh at me. He said, well, you got to be more particular than that. How about Germany, he says. I say, and so he says, we got to be more particular than that.
My goodness.
So I said, well, look, how about sending me to some place that's just beautiful in the mountains where you'd like to go yourself? That's where he sent me. So my wife and I had 2 great years in a small little village in Germany where I was the only military unit there, and had 2 wonderful years of serving our country. And those are 2 years, I'll tell you something about the military, and I think that my son's a military officer now today, but he hasn't been called on active duty yet, and I think we're downsizing the services that most people don't get that experience. But Gus, when you're in charge of a group of men at a young age, that teaches you something that no other job can teach you. It taught me to look out for my troops, to be sure they were fed, to be sure they got taken care of, be sure they had their shots, to go get them out of a bar when they got drunk and go get in trouble. To look, had family problems, to bring them in and sit down and put my arm around them and talk to them about what happened to their girlfriend or what happened to their mom or their daddy. And in some cases, and some that would have something bad happen to them, you got to be there and to take care of them and deal with their parents. That's a responsibility that most people don't get at age 22 or 23 or 24 years of age.
Your story about military service really strikes home to me. I requested that I be stationed at Fort Polk, and I ended up in Frankfurt, Germany.
If you'd done just the reverse, if you would have said,
Of course.
It's either Fort
We
Polk.
only learned later, however. Henson, you practiced law for a while in Baton Rouge.
7 years.
And how did you decide to make that initial race for Congress in '57?
I thought about doing what most people would do who think about going into public service. I felt strongly about public service. I knew I wanted to do something because this upbringing I had from my father and strong feelings about trying to do something to help your fellow man, to help make a place a better place to live. And I think most of us feel like Louisiana can use better government. And so I felt like, well, maybe I can get involved. So I asked my law partners, and it was a real fine law firm, could I run for the city council or the state legislature, a part-time thing, and still stay a lawyer? And they said, no, you can't serve 2 jealous mistresses. The law is a jealous mistress, and politics is one. It'll never work. You can't. You've got to do something full-time if you're going to do it. And so we looked around, and there wasn't anything full-time to run for. And the next year, lo and behold, the congressional race was coming up. That was 1974. And so we decided, well, if I've got to run for something full-time, why not Congress? And so we ran with 1% name identification, nobody thinking we could win.
Not a chance.
Not a chance in the world. Matter of fact, all of our supporters met in my kitchen one Saturday morning to talk about it, and that was me and my wife. And we decided we'd do it. And as luck would have it, we won.
That was an interesting race. A young man who worked for a television station ran against the incumbent, Judge Rarick, ultra-conservative, and he beat Rarick.
That's right.
And then you ran against him and defeated him. Close race.
Very close. Matter of fact, it was the closest race in federal history up until about 2 or 3 years ago. I think the final difference was something like 44 votes. Then they had us rerun the race because it was so close. But the final vote count was something like 44 votes. The closest race anywhere in recorded history for the Senate or President or Congress. It had been many, many more than that. Then here about 6 or 7 years ago, there was a race, I believe, in Indiana where somebody won by 20 or 24 votes, and that broke our record. But
was there a particular figure, a president or senator, who inspired you and whom you attempted to kind of model your politics on?
Not really.
Not really.
I'd say that what I learned in Louisiana, what I learned at home, what I learned from friends, and what I just had in my gut and what I had in my insides told me what I wanted to do and how to do it. When I got to Washington, what I found is a lot of the figures you respect on one issue, you differ with them on another. And so, no, I didn't really have a role model in Washington.
Were you a lifelong Republican?
No. As a matter of fact, all of our family were Democrats. I was a Democrat. I think I registered to vote in 1960 as a Democrat. And then I got back in the service, and in 1969 I changed to Republican. And the reason was not I thought I was going to run for office, Gus. I just kept looking at Louisiana, and I said, I believe in competition in everything. I think competition in business offers our consumers the best product. I believe competition in sports offers us the best performance by our athletes. And so I said, I think we need competition in politics. And I didn't see a competitive system. We had factions back then, the long
Yes.
faction, the
And the
Kennan
anti,
faction,
yeah.
and the anti-longs. I didn't think that was as good. And so I changed in 1969 out of the very noble idea, when we had something like 20,000 Republicans across Louisiana, to try to build a competing system or party to offer competition and therefore better government. And I guess if I'd thought about running for office, I might never have changed.
Of course.
Because it'd be easier to run as a Democrat than as a Republican.
Even humble citizens like myself have learned a lot about Congress. We watch C-SPAN, and we see some terribly frustrating things and some things that anger us. And I'm talking about just the system of Congress. What kind of experience was that for you? For example, how long did it take you to realize, that you weren't going to be able to change the world the first term,
Pretty quick. There's an old story. You're sitting there on the floor of the House, and you're looking around you, and you're somewhat in awe, and that's the truth when you first get there. And an old-timer comes over and sits down next to you and says, well, what are you thinking? And the response is, I'm just in awe. I'm looking around all these famous people and all these well-known politicians, and I'm wondering how it is I came to be here. He said, you wait about 6 months, you go look around the room, wonder how all the rest of them came to be here.
And was that true?
It was kind of true. The greatest honor I ever received in my life was being elected to that office. That's a wonderful feeling when people entrust you with a high office. The idea to go to Washington and try to make the laws for this great country was the greatest responsibility, honor I'd ever had in my life. I always love it. I'll always look back on it as being the wonderful years of my life. I spent 12 years there, 6 terms. But Gus, near the end, I was very frustrated. I would not have stayed. As a Republican, you don't run the place. The Democrats run it. And so it's hard to get your bills up. It's hard to get your amendments passed because the place runs far too partisan to suit me and to suit, I think, most Louisianians. Louisianians aren't that partisan. They're interested in government. They want government to perform. They don't really care who does it or what label they wear to do it. In Washington, label means everything. And it's not with all people, but with the majority of them. And so I was very frustrated not being able to get things done that I wanted to do. I'd worked twice as hard to accomplish half as much as somebody who was a Democrat. And so I finally decided that I didn't want to do that anymore. And when 1986 rolled around, I made the decision not to do that anymore.
You ran an unsuccessful race for the Senate with Senator John Breaux. And I want to ask you, that defeat, did it knock you back? Did it take you some time to put yourself together? How did it affect you emotionally?
It took me about 12 hours to get over it.
It did, that quickly.
We knew for about 2 to 3 weeks out from the polls that we were not making headway and that we were not able to actually hit 50%. And so we knew the odds of us winning were not good. So I had 2 to 3 weeks before the race to lay in bed at night with my wife and to talk about it and to get over it, to get ready for it. By the time the election loss came, I was emotionally and mentally prepared for it. What I did, I came home that night from the victory celebration.
Of course.
And went home to my house in Baton Rouge and sat there and sat up all night just thinking about it, thinking it through. Went back over every step of that campaign. What should I have done differently? What could I have done differently? And by the time the sun came up that morning and friends started coming by the house to visit with me, it was over. I had gone through it and decided everything could have been done. It could have been done. And sure, you'd do some things differently, but I don't think it would have made any difference. Louisiana had selected who they thought was the best man, who's turned out to be a fine senator. He and I are good friends today.
I was going to ask you, do y'all enjoy a good relationship?
Absolutely, absolutely. So in any event, with that being the case, I put it behind me and never looked back. And to this day, it's something that I'm not a good loser. Nobody likes losing. But anytime you have a head-to-head contest like that, somebody's got to lose.
Henson, what did you do then following that?
I then went to Washington and joined a large national law firm to practice law in Washington for 2 years, Gus, 1987 and 1988, and enjoyed that. It was nice to see what the big-time law practice is like, so to speak, and big law firms and all that sort of thing. And did that until the president won the election and gave me a call one day.
And you were named Deputy Secretary of the Department of Energy.
Mm-hmm.
And that leads us to a topic that I would be remiss if I didn't go into. Will the oil industry in Louisiana, for example, will it ever make a comeback?
Not like we saw it in the early 80s.
It will not.
No. Those were go-go years or boom years when the tax code would cause people to invest money in an oil deal and they were getting tax benefits off of it whether or not you ever struck oil or not. And that really wasn't the way to do it. So the tax law changed that. In addition to that, the oil reserves in this country are going down. The few big elephants, we call them, big oil fields left to be discovered are not that many. And while our independents in this country will continue to drill, we'll find small oil deposits and be able to make a living off of it and help our economy and our country by doing that, the oil industry is not what it's going to be. Somebody gave me a statistic, Gus, that in all the world, something like the majority of the holes drilled in the ground looking for oil have been in the United States. Well, you know all the oil in the world is not in the United States.
Hardly.
And so the other parts of the world now are seeing the kind of oil booms that we saw in the 30s and the 40s and the 50s and the 60s. That's now taking place in Russia and in the Far East and any number of places in the world, in Africa and even down in Ecuador and places of that nature. So you're seeing the large major oil companies moving slowly but surely out of their operations out of the United States and into these foreign countries. And what's going to be left behind are our independents, the people that live down the street from us that are small-time oil and gas operators, who will continue to look for gas and oil. There'll continue to be jobs to be had, but it'll never be the boom it was.
Never be that way
Never be that way again.
Let me ask you another question that I think people all across the country would be interested in. Having studied it and knowing it forwards and backwards, how do you feel about this nuclear energy? Are we safe with it? Is it okay?
Yeah. The bill that passed this week by the Senate, the final energy bill sent to the President to be signed, is a tribute to the President, who worked very hard to pass that, tribute to Bennett Johnson, whose leadership as an Energy Committee chairman had never really been tested before. This is the first major piece of good energy legislation passed in probably 30 or 40 years. It addresses nuclear energy. Nuclear energy's got two problems. One, it takes forever to build a nuclear power plant, and therefore it costs too much. So it's not cost competitive with natural gas or coal. And secondly, you've got to deal with the safety factor has been largely dealt with, but it ought to be improved on some more. Then you've got to deal with the nuclear waste problem. What do you do with these spent fuel rods that are radioactive for 10 or 15,000 years? What do you do with those?
Goodness.
And so this bill addresses those things. First of all, you cut down the time it takes to get a plant certified. So half of the cost of building a nuclear power plant is interest. So if you can cut the dime from 12 years down to 6, as they do in Europe, you're going to cut the cost in half of a power plant. It suddenly becomes price competitive again. We know it's good for the environment in the sense it's not creating smoke or it's not creating things, but you have the waste to deal with, and you have the safety factors. We're designing 2 new nuclear plants right now that'll be through in about another 2 to 3 years that have improved safety, and we really have had no failures of equipment failure. We had a human failure at 3 Mile Island, and that was contained. It worked. Safety precautions worked. We're now developing plants that are even foolproof. There's no way to have one have a meltdown or to cause any kind of release.
We couldn't have a Chernobyl.
We never. Those plants are a different design. They did not have containment systems like we have in this country, so we could never have a Chernobyl in this country already. But the newer plants we're going to build couldn't even have a 3 Mile Island proposition where you may have some radioactive water leak out or something. That relieves the last question. What do you do with the waste? The idea now is to build a repository inside a granite mountain out in Nevada and store it there until its nuclear radioactivity finally dissipates. Every country in the world is looking at that. France is looking at that. England is looking at that. That's the state-of-the-art technology. But we've got an even better idea we're working on now in our laboratories, things called transmutation. I think of my Calvin and Hobbes comic strip where he's got this cardboard box and he calls it transmogrification. He writes on it. It changes things.
Yes.
Well, he's pretty close to being accurate. Our scientists are now looking at a way to change the molecular structure of something so you can take nuclear waste and put it into an accelerator and change it from something radioactive into something that's inert. And we're working on that right now. So I think we're not more than, I don't know, maybe a decade away from science breaking through in this country, as it always does, to take an intractable problem like 15,000 years of radioactivity and change it into something that's like gravel.
Henson, when you sat in that office, the number 2 man in the Department of Energy of the United States, your mind had to go back to growing up in the oil patch in Hackberry, Louisiana, huh?
It did.
What an American story, you know. I mean, only in America, truly.
One of the greatest thrills I have is to this day when I go out and speak to audiences around the country, particularly energy audiences, people will say, you've been a real friend of the oil and gas industry. And I feel good about that because I grew up in it, my wife grew up in it, I think I understand it. It's been so important to the history of our state, the economy of our state. So many people have made their living in that business. And it's a greatly misunderstood business. We're looked upon today as being some kind of a villain or polluter.
Yes.
A lot of the problems the oil and gas industry caused in the 30s and the 40s and the 50s of leaving pits behind with waste in it or digging canals, those were things that were done before we even knew about the environment or what the damages were. They're not done today. And so being the number 2 in that department and having a hand in the building of this legislation, a hand in the future of that industry, is something I feel proud of.
What is your answer? I don't want to go into politics, partisan politics too heavily, but I must ask you because we're talking about energy. Briefly, what kind of answer? I heard Governor Clinton say on television that this country has no energy policy. How would you respond to that quickly?
That's partisan rhetoric in the campaign. Louisianians are really smart about politics. They know not to pay a whole lot of attention to speeches during a campaign year. The national energy strategy we built over 3.5 years is the first real strategy that we've had written. Well, I take it back. President Carter had one called the National Energy Policy. This one is more complete, more varied, more detailed than that one. It's an improvement over that one. And it is one, it's in writing now. It must be some 198, 200 pages long. It's something that anybody can get by writing to the Department of Energy and asking for a copy of it. And that's just the first edition. Next year, the second edition will come out to continue to improve on it. The legislation that passed was from that national energy strategy. The strategy said, here's what we need, here's what we got to do to get it. And this legislation was part of that. Research and development going on in our laboratories is part of that. Converting the federal fleets, things the president can do, is part of that. And so we do have a strategy, and it's one that's beginning to work and take hold. And that bill that passed and it's going to go to the president was a major example of that.
Henson, your next position, I was about to call it job, but that hardly summarizes it. Tell me how you found out that you were going to be Deputy Chief of Staff to the President of the United States. How did that little gem of news reach you?
Struck terror in my heart, Gus. It reached me on an early phone call in Oman. I was in Oman on Department of Energy oil business, dealing with the oil sheikhs over there to urge them to let our oil companies come there and to buy American equipment, American pipes and valves, things made right here in Louisiana, service companies from Louisiana, to convince them to, it was on the heels of the Gulf War. I was there exactly 1 year after the Gulf War, and the idea was to remind them, all right, we pulled your chestnuts out of the fire. We expect something for that. We expect you to hire our people and to do our work. And I was getting response from them. They were pledging they were going to do it and that sort of thing. And going back to my hotel room that night, and I got a call saying, when are you going to be back in the country? And I said, two or three more days. I had to go to Yemen yet. And they said 2 or 3 more days. They said, when you get back, report straight to the White House. President wants to talk to you.
Wow.
And I said, what's this about? He said, we're not going to tell you on the telephone, but he wants to see you the minute you get back. And so I had 4 or 5 days to wonder, what have I done? The President of the United States is calling for me in Oman to come report back. And so the minute I got back, I had no sleep on the airplane. I stumbled over to the White House and stumbled in to see then Chief of Staff, Sam Skinner, and ultimately the President.
And
he told me what he wanted. He said that they had looked around the entire administration for somebody to be number 2 at the White House, and they had looked at other number 2s in the departments or agencies or whatever, and they thought that I was the person. And the President had known me for years, felt comfortable with me. He was going into a re-election campaign, and that nobody in the White House had ever run for office before, except the President.
Interesting? I never
and
thought
he said,
of
I
that.
want somebody who's run for office, who understands it, somebody I know, and somebody who has proven himself in the administration as being a good number 2. And I didn't want to leave the Department of Energy, but I went back and talked to Admiral Watkins, who is the Secretary of Energy and a close friend of mine and a mentor of mine. And he said exactly what you probably say, Gus. He said, look, you serve the President. If this is what he wants you to do, it's what you got to do.
There really is no choice.
There really is no choice. Yeah. And so I went back to meet with him again, and he said, this is what I want. I want you to do this. And so I did.
Now, Henson, I want to talk to you about this business of working at the scene of all power in the world, the White House. I want to find out, though, not the political side, but the human side, about the President, Mrs. Bush. My wife even asked me to ask you about Millie.
They have the run of the place, Millie and Ranger. They're everywhere, on the sofas.
Tell me about George Bush, the man, and if you can do it in something that illustrates the kind of man he is personally.
The greatest thrill, and you're right, it is the seat of power. It breeds, if Machiavelli had been an American, that's where he would have worked. Yes. Because there are people like that there, always plotting around the president and doing this. I don't care for that, I don't like that. I was victimized by it much of the time I was there, because they found me as an easy straight man, because I was just doing exactly what the president wanted, not worrying about the Machiavellian side of politics. But there is a pleasant side to it, and that's what you're asking me the question about. And that's the opportunity to be with a president and a first lady all day, every day, to be with them traveling, to be with them social occasions, to be with them in the office, to see them when nobody else is around but just the chief of staff and yourself. and what are they like.
Talk with the president.
I have written a journal. I was told by a good friend of mine, Judy Foyle here in Baton Rouge, who teaches English at LSU, that I ought to write a journal of my observations of that, not to write a book. That wouldn't be fair, wouldn't be right to the president, but to give to my children and grandchildren to read someday, but what it was like. And I've done that. That every day I've been there. First time in my life I ever kept a diary or anything like that. And the thing that has been the most rewarding about being in the White House is not the power and all that sort of riding on Marine One and Air Force One and dining with him and going to the economic summit with him in July and being there with him. And that's not what's really great about it. What's really great about it is seeing a president privately and seeing him deal with problems, seeing what kind of person he is.
Is it a terrible, awesome job?
It is, but it's amazing. I've never been around but one president that closely, and so I can't speak but for any others. This one does not seem to be mired down or weighted down by it. He seems to be the kind of person who's been prepared for it by years of work in government and vice president and whatever, to where he's used to it and he deals with it. And as he said in New Orleans in his speech here this week when he was here, he said, look, he said, you know, the buck stops there. You know, there's no maybe. It's yes or no. You got to make the decision.
Is he a warm man or pretentious?
Oh, he's very warm.
He is.
And very unpretentious. Matter of fact, that I'll give you a good example of what kind of man he is. He likes to play horseshoes. We all know that. Most people don't know who he plays horseshoes with. He plays horseshoes with the people who mow the lawn at the White House.
Right.
He has a horseshoe pit built, and he will go out at night when those fellows are off work and play horseshoes with the groundskeepers at the White House and the electricians and people like that. They love him.
What are his hours?
His hours, he starts work, he gets in the office at 7 a.m., and that was back before the campaign started. He's in the office at 7 a.m., he's an early riser, reads about 11 newspapers between 5 in the morning and when he shows up in the Oval Office at about 7. He works all day and generally not many evenings free, but if he has an evening free, he's back over in the residence maybe at 7 in the evening. So I'd say he puts in a 12-hour day every day.
How obtrusive is that, and particularly on his life and the first family, how obtrusive is that constant security? There's always someone there, is there not?
Absolutely. Everywhere he is, the Secret Service is there. You go up into the residence where he actually lives, the Secret Service at the door before you can actually get into where the residence is. Mrs. Bush was telling a funny story the other day. She said that Churchill had come many, many times to the White House during World War II to get American help for the war and whatever. And he had a particular bedroom he stayed in. And he liked it. It's called the Queen's bedroom. He came back under the Eisenhower years, and they thought they'd honor him by putting him in the Lincoln bedroom, the most famous room in the whole White House. Middle of the night, the guards come around, these obtrusive people, to check on you, see if you're there. He's not there. They sound the alarms. Guards are running everywhere. Old Winston Churchill had got up in the middle of the night and padded across the hall and went down the hall to his old bedroom, and there he was, sound asleep.
Oh, what a wonderful story.
In his old bedroom.
How about Mrs. Bush? What kind of lady?
Mrs. Bush is everybody's grandmother. She is a wonderful, warm person who doesn't take politics seriously, doesn't let anything flap her. One day, I was walking into the Oval Office to visit with the president. She was just coming out. And I said, Ms. Bush, good morning. And she said, oh, Henson, call me Barbara. And I said, no, ma'am. You're Mrs. Bush. Mrs. Bush. I said, I'll call you Mrs. B if you want me to, but no Barbara.
Is she tough?
She is tough in a very, very, very gentle way. She's tough in the sense that her children respect her, people around her respect her, because you know she's somebody who has deep-seated convictions, beliefs, and a special relationship between two people who've been married so long and been through so much. But tough in a political sense, or tough in being hard, no. No, she's everybody's grandmother.
Is he very dependent on her?
Oh, yes. He never fails to call her around the road. Every time I get in the helicopter, Marine One with him, and he'd wave to the crowd. Before he gets in the helicopter, he'd look up to the residence, 2 stories up where she was, and she'd be there, and he'd wave if she was in town.
So they have a lovely relationship.
Absolutely. Never failed.
How about as a mother to that very large brood of kids, some who've had trouble?
Oh, and the grandchildren.
And the grandchildren.
I mean, the big brood of grandchildren. They are both extremely close to their children. Family to all of us is important, and they're the kind of American family we ought to believe families ought to be like. Very close to the grandchildren. The president takes the grandchildren with him everywhere he can. I get on Marine One, Air Force One with him, and lo and behold, here's 3 grandchildren running them down the airplane or something. That anytime he can have them with him, they're with him.
When the children have had problems, Neil, and I think there was a divorce in the family, can you tell that it's affecting the mother and father, the very human side?
I've only been around them during 1 or 2 of these points of travail, and they respond like any parent would.
Same.
Privately, it's a tremendous pain never worrying about themselves, any kind of political embarrassment. Never have seen that even discussed. It's a matter of, like any normal parent, I feel for my child, I hurt for my child. A little anger sometime when the press kind of overplays it, they get a little mad at the press about doing it, just as we would if the press went after one of our children. But that's about it.
So Henson, you're painting a picture that I really of some very normal human beings.
Absolutely. This man, people think, was born to wealth, and this man had nothing in the world except his wife, and I think all of his children were born in Texas. He tells a story in 1946, 47, 48. He got in a Studebaker and drove to Texas and went to work in the oil fields out there as a salesman, and then worked his way up and finally worked his way up to forming Zapata Oil Company that we all know about and have heard of, and operated right here in Louisiana for years, and then decided to go into public service.
How's the food at the White House? The daily food? Is there a mess there for the senior
Interesting
staff?
thing, there's a thing called the White House mess. At Gus, you come to Washington, standing invitation, I'll take you to lunch there. It's very small. It's where the president often has lunch himself. It's where the assistants of the president have lunch. It's run by the Navy. Hence the name mess. It is a military-run mess, the Navy mess. The food isn't very good.
Of course, coming from Louisiana, how could
You're
it
right,
be?
you're right.
Yeah.
But there's one kid from up here in central Louisiana that works in the White House mess as career Navy, 12 years old. And every now and then he and I conspire, and he'll whip up a gumbo. And when he does that, the place is sold out.
Tell us about travel on Air Force One. I mean, it's so huge. And
Air Force One is probably the finest airplane in the world. It's a 747. It was built during the days when Reagan was president. It is a flying White House, is exactly what it is. Wherever the president goes, a White House has to go with him. He has to have his military advisors along. He's got to have the red phone in case there's a military emergency. He's got to have his communications people. He's got to have his staff people around him. And so this thing is a flying office. The very nose of the airplane, the very front of the airplane is a bedroom for him, because very often when he's flying cross-country or overseas, he's got to get rest, and so he can go in and lay down and go to sleep. That's a very, very smart idea. Behind that is an office where he actually works. And when he's flying, he's working, signing papers, meeting with staff, on the phone. He continues to function as president. Behind that's a miniature operating room in case something happens. We remember the John F. Kennedy days, and we want to be able to have, in case something happens, and on that airplane is a doctor, 2 nurses, and you've got a regular little hospital room right there. They can do almost anything on board that aircraft in case of an emergency. And one day we had an accident occur. A member of the press got by a jet blast thrown across the tarmac and became scraped up and hurt. And they wheeled him up in there and put him in there, and an hour later he was fine shape. They'd really taken care of him and fixed him up. Next to that is a galley, and next to that is an office where the senior staff, where I usually sit, and the National Security Advisor. Then you got 2 big staff rooms. Right, next big thing is a big conference room, where the president can hold conferences on board the aircraft, and often will do that, bill signing ceremonies and whatever. Then a couple of big staff rooms and rooms with all kind of computer equipment. And then in the back of the aircraft, the back third of the aircraft looks like a regular airplane. And that's where the seats are for the Secret Service and for the press corps that go along with Air Force One. But it is an unbelievable airplane, has every kind of communications equipment you can imagine. Anywhere in the world, the president can be in touch with anybody in the world on board that aircraft. And it's a real thrill. The other day we were in California, and we took off, and there was an air show about 20 miles away. And so we rigged it up that we'd fly over the air show and that Air Force One real low so the crowd could see it. And of course the crowd went bananas. They got a big kick out of it.
Henson, I want to ask you about some of the folks with whom you've worked in the White House and who you've come in contact with, because these are people most of us read about in our newspapers, our television, our Time magazine. I want to start with a man who fascinates me, General Colin Powell. What's your impression of him?
During the war, the Department of Energy had a lot to do with that war, because in fact we were picking out some of the nuclear targets inside Iraq, and secondly we were assessing for the president the threats of damage to oil shipments into the free world and oil pipelines and the refinery fires and all the fires going on in Kuwait. And so I had a chance to be in some of the National Security Council meetings and watch Colin Powell. Colin Powell is exactly what you'd want in time of need in this country.
Steady.
A very cool, calm cucumber. Knows exactly what he's doing, steady as a rock. And the thing that I liked about this president is he didn't try to run the war. The president could be in a meeting with Colin Powell and top generals and with Secretary of Defense Dick Cheney, and he'd listen to them, he'd ask questions, he'd ask their recommendation. The decision was made, he turned it over to them to run. and Colin Powell ran it.
Where were you when the decision was actually made to begin the Gulf War?
Now, that's another interesting story. I was in Venezuela in the presidential palace with President Carlos Andres Perez of Venezuela, in the palace having dinner with Robert Mosbacher. We'd gone down there to try to open up trade, and we were down there to try to open up areas for the American oil industry to operate, because they had once thrown us out and are now trying to get us back in. We were having dinner with the president of Venezuela when suddenly I got a tap on my shoulder and a whisper in my ear from one of the service personnel along with us that the bombing had started. And so I looked at Bob Mosbacher, we looked at each other, we hastily finished the dinner, went into a room with the president of Venezuela to watch the television, and picked it up and saw the first aircraft taking off to make the bombing runs. And we immediately, this was in the evening, and first thing in the next morning, we're supposed to stay 2 more days, we got an aircraft to head back to the United States, because there was going to be a big meeting of the cabinet the next day with the president too.
Did you know that war was coming?
We all hoped not, no. I was attending meetings of the National Security Council, and the people that knew we were actually going to attack were very few, and that they never let on. It was a very well-kept secret that they knew when we were going to have to start the bombing and at what time. We all hoped that Saddam Hussein would have had the sense to realize that we were serious, and I don't think he ever thought we would attack him.
Did the president agonize over that decision to go into combat?
That was before I joined the White House,
Yes.
so I did not see him personally, but I've heard him talk about it. And I've watched him make other decisions. Agonized in the sense that on his heart and his mind, he knew what he was doing and he weighed very heavily. But in terms of being indecisive, no. He knew what he had to do and he did it. And he made the decision and then he'd pray. A very religious man.
What's a cabinet meeting like?
Cabinet meeting with the president is, the press is usually brought in for the first few minutes, let them take pictures, and the press is asked to leave, so the people in the cabinet can really tell the president what they think. And he can really have a meeting with his cabinet with no holds barred and talk about it.
Is that a fact that no holds are barred once the press leaves?
Not as much as you would think. Quite frankly, the cabinet's gotten a little too big. We're up to 13 members of the cabinet now. And that's sometimes things leak out. There is talk, and the president has proposed the idea of maybe cutting back the number of cabinet positions to 6, combining these agencies. It'd save the taxpayers some money, cut down some of the bureaucracy, but more importantly, it would get the group down to a small enough size where the president could really have a meeting with them and accomplish something. Most of the meetings of the cabinet, and I've been to many of them representing the Department of Energy, and most of them are a matter of the president. He usually has meetings usually once a week, once every 2 weeks, more than most presidents do. He will sit and discuss a particular subject, ask everybody around the table their thoughts on the subject. He'll usually keep his counsel about what he's going to do. He's asking for their advice more than anything else. He seldom makes a decision in front of the cabinet.
What's it like to work with the CIA?
The only working I've done with them over the years has been during the course of the Persian Gulf War.
Yes.
They're very, very, very capable people. They've been much maligned. These people are what stands between us and some kind of plot going somewhere in the world and catching us off guard. They're very professional. They know what's going on. In the case of the Persian Gulf War, the CIA and the Department of Energy worked very closely together to pick the targets and to assess the bomb damage to the targets on oil fields and nuclear facilities and whatever, and I found them to be very professional.
Did you attend any meetings at the CIA? Did you get?
No, we did them all in what we call the Situation Room at the White House.
And what's that like, the Situation Room at the White House?
It's like being in a bunker.
Science fiction?
Yeah, it's almost like that. It's partly below ground, totally sealed off in terms of you can't from the outside hear or see anything going on the inside, no windows or anything like that.
Sounds like Las Vegas, which has no windows and no clocks. Yeah.
Except a little less glitz.
A little less glitz.
No tables. And it's, you sit around the table, and generally there's called a deputies group. And that was what I was a member, the number 2s.
Yes.
Generally deal with these daily meetings to discuss the progress of the war and what's going on. Then we had a situation set up, one wall were TV screens. And that if somebody couldn't be at that meeting, it was somewhere else, they had a closed-circuit television system that could not be penetrated by outside intelligence sources, where that person could see all of us and we could see him and communicate back and forth like that. Very sophisticated. And so that was interesting, but going through something like that and going through a war like that on the inside, watching that thing being handled that way.
Henson, let me
try. By the way,
yeah.
Our people are good, both military and Secret Service. We proved that in the Persian Gulf. They're the best in the world, and the Russians saw that. And one of the things that hastened the decline of the Soviet Union is they saw what we did and realized we were so far ahead of them. That in tactics and capability.
Oh, that's so interesting, and it's an observation that I've never heard before. So they kind of went to school on our handling of the...
The tactics used by Hussein, to a great extent, were Russian tactics. The equipment he used was Russian equipment. Some cases not first line, but second line. And we absolutely just destroyed it and brushed it out of the way with lightning tactics we had developed for a war in Europe that we used. And we did things that have never been done in the military annals of history. We moved more troops on the ground when the ground attack happened. We moved more troops more quickly, further than any time in history.
How closely did the president follow that war?
Oh, he was with it every day.
Every day.
Absolutely. He normally gets a national security briefing at 8 a.m. every morning for about a half hour, telling what's going on around the world. During the war, of course, it was even more.
I want to run some other notables in the administration for your, I was about to say for your off-the-record comment. I'm trying to sucker you, huh? How about Budget Director Dorman? What kind of a man?
Brilliant. He knows it, but he's somebody who absolutely, if the president calls him and says, is there money in here for this? Is there money for that? What's the problem with this? The other day, he asked him, Governor Clinton was talking about raising taxes. What does that mean? Dorman's the kind of guy that can get the answer very quickly. He knows the government inside and out. Is truly probably close to a genius, an intellect, if not a genius.
Who's the brightest man outside of the president whom you've met in government? Just the pure best intellectual, sharpest of minds.
Well, the sharpest minds, the people who are the most brilliant, people like John Sununu and Richard Dorman, but people who are very smart, not necessarily in intellect, but in just intelligence and knowing how to do things, are people like Dick Cheney, people like Colin Powell, people like Admiral Watkins I served under, the people who really know how, who are above average in intelligence, not brilliant, but know how to use common sense and how to deal with people and put that together with better than average intelligence.
Now, how about John Sununu? What kind of a man is he? I have such mixed feelings when I've observed him, you know.
Most people have mixed feelings for him, and some people come out on the negative side. Sununu was a difficult guy to work with when I was at the Department of Energy.
Demanding.
Very demanding. Also, thinks he knows an awful lot, and
Yes.
he does. I mean, he's a very bright man. But he's also, his role as Chief of Staff was to be spear catcher for the President. And after 3 years of that, he'd caught so many spears that he was dead.
That's absolutely a no-win job, isn't it?
Exactly. He had to be replaced, and he knew that. He was playing a role that was designed as Chief of Staff. So a lot of people who attribute a lot of problems of the President to John Sununu, that was Sununu's job is to take the blame for those problems, whether he was really responsible for them or not. And so a lot of the things people blame him for really weren't his fault.
How about the former Secretary of State, Jim Baker?
Well, he's one of the brightest men in politics today, no question about it. I work with him now. I've known him for a long time, but I sit and watch him now from inside the White House. He's very cool, he's very calm.
He appears very cool.
He is extremely much so.
Not a lot of emotional show, huh?
He'd be a good Louisianian because he loves politics, knows it, understands it, plays it tough. He's the best there is in the Republican Party. There is nobody better than him to figure out a strategy and how to run a campaign, how to do things. I think if the President does not win this campaign, one of the reasons would be that maybe Jim Baker wasn't there soon enough. Maybe he should have been there last year instead of this year. He's that good. He surrounded himself for a very close group of people that he brought with him who've been with him since, I guess, about 1984. People that he trusts implicitly. There are no leaks. There's no backstabbing. There's no fighting. Machiavelli has been banished. The thing is running very smoothly now under his guidance.
How about the press secretary? His name escapes me.
Marlon Fitzwater.
Yeah, what kind of guy is he? He looks delightful.
He is delightful. He is
tough job, though, huh?
Tough job, but he's considered probably the best there is. He's now been in the White House a long time. He's been there now, I think, I don't know, 11 or 12 years. Been there a long time.
And there is no way that he can satisfy his constituency, the press. Right. There is no way.
Right. But they have great respect for him. He's got a real sense of humor. And that's a wonderful thing to have in politics, to be able to deal with a tough situation and laugh about it. He goes in to brief the press every day. And of course, in an election year like this, the press are really tough. And they're after him, just eating on him all day long. And he'll laugh about it. He's got a real sense of humor. He's a real funny guy.
Does he have plenty of access to the president?
Oh, yes. The president thinks highly of him. The press will call Marlon a dozen times a day about something he's seen or what did you think about this. Whenever the president travels, Marlon's always with him to oversee the press operation, watch what's going on. And Marlon and the president are very close.
Getting back to Jim Baker, he and the president seem to enjoy a unique relationship, huh?
It's probably the closest relationship in the Bush administration. They go way back to before either one of them were in politics in Texas, when they were both good friends in Houston. And Jim Baker has been at President Bush's side every step of his advance in politics, through Congress and through all the rest. They're very, very close. They understand each other. Their families are very close. And it's one of these unique things in politics when you know that the number one, the President of the United States, has somebody that's that close to him, that's been with him that long. It's most unusual in politics.
Henson, looking way ahead now so that we don't attempt to cast any light on the outcome of the current presidential election,